So it's been a little while since I've done one of these video blogs. Frankly, I've been a bit preoccupied by an offshoot of the foreclosure defense practice, and that is prosecuting these cases where the banks and institutions have taken it upon themselves to kick down the doors, drill out the locks, and break into homes of Americans all across this country, and specifically here in the state of Florida. Now, I've been crisscrossing the state on these cases and attempting to establish some law, some rule, which states the basic proposition that when you own a home in this state, you can be safe and secure in that home without fear of an unwarranted, unreasonable, unnoticed seizure by a bank or institution who, in many cases, are acting as an arm or a unit of the federal government, specifically through their agencies, Fannie, Freddie, Housing and Urban Development, and they are acting under the presumptive authority of those federal sub-agencies, quasi-agencies, but in effect federal agencies. The banks are acting under this presumptive authority and then using that as a basis and a justification for kicking down the doors of Americans' homes, drilling out the locks, and inspecting, quote-unquote, or winterizing on a regular basis. Now, it's most disturbing to me that this happens unchecked all across this country. We have examples in virtually every state, but what I find most disturbing is that when homeowners might come upon this kind of dangerous burglary and they call law enforcement will go the other way. They will leave that homeowner unprotected because the agent from the bank, the jackbooted thug, the inspector, will simply tell the law enforcement officer that I'm here for the bank and that I'm permitted to do this, and that is enough to send the law enforcement officer on the way. Now, we have to understand that this is creating a very, very dangerous circumstance, both in those individual cases, because anytime you have people unwanted on an American's property, that sets up a dangerous condition. But far more important is the much bigger picture that's being painted all across this country. And that is, we are affirming this corporatism. We are affirming this fascism. We are affirming the degradation of individual rights and specifically the destruction of America's basic right to be safe and secure in one's property. That's what's happening all across communities in this entire country. It's a dangerous wave that's making its way all across this nation, and it's something that we all have to push back against and stop. Because the corporations are becoming empowered. They're empowered because our court system is failing to stand up and say that no, you, corporations, banks, institutions, Wall Street, do not have the right to kick down the door of people's property under any circumstances, much less under circumstances where you fail to even call the borrower and say, hey, by the way, we're going to come kick down your door. You don't provide any writing to say, hey, by the way, if we don't hear back from you in 10 days, we're going to kick down your door and drill out your rights. Drill out your locks. And so the problem is we are creating in this country a dangerous phenomena where the banks and institutions are empowered and are operating in a completely lawless fashion that sets up a more dangerous condition sweeping all across the country. So that difficult, very difficult battle, it's trench warfare that is mind-boggling to me to think that as an attorney, I live in a country, I'm trying to establish a very basic and simple proposition, which is that Americans should be able to feel safe in their homes. They shouldn't feel unsafe, and they shouldn't feel that their door can be kicked in at any moment unannounced by inspectors from the banks, and that if that happens, there's no consequence for the bank. And yet, all across this state, I'm rebuffed, I'm pushed back, there's much resistance on this. And that brings us to the much larger point. It's sort of an overview on what's happening in foreclosures in general all across this country, and frankly, specifically focusing on what's happening here in this state. You know, the books behind your law books, they are a culmination of hundreds of years worth of decisional law that existed in this state and frankly across the country, in addition to statutory law. Now, the law was supposed to exist to protect individuals and to protect, frankly, this country, and to install a stable and secure environment for us all to live and flourish in. There sets up a balance between corporate interests and the desire for capitalism and entrepreneurialism and those elements of our society that makes this country great and productive. The laws are supposed to set up a balance between those desires and interests to have a vibrant and growing economy, and balance that against the rights of individuals and safety and prosperity of the people of this country. But what we see happening in this country is that the rights and the demands of the corporations have become absolutely superior in a dramatic way to the rights and the interests of individuals. Individual liberty is a concept that is being eviscerated and destroyed every single day in this country. Less and less of our freedoms are being recognized and respected, while more and more of the corporate power is gaining dangerous footholds all across this country. You know, an example of that is what happened in Charlotte a few weeks ago. The Charlotte City Council had passed rules that restricted the free speech, or that restricted the ability of individuals to speak freely and to protest and to walk around with placards and signs. And the justification for that was state security, city security, national security. And what we saw during the Bank of America shareholders meeting was those laws that were passed, presumably to protect public safety, were used and utilized to enforce a sort of corporate closed culture and lack of desire to face shareholders and to, frankly, prevent individuals from speaking freely about the tyranny that the corporations were engaged in. And again, what's so significant about that is we have the institution of government through city and municipal lawmaking and our local law enforcement becoming adjuncts of the corporation, in that case specifically Bank of America. So our government, I use that in quotes, it's not really our government anymore, our government at the legislative level and the executive function level, along with law enforcement enforcing those things, had become adjuncts of private corporations, and then our government was being used against us to eliminate, destroy, snuff out, desecrate fundamental rights. Those fundamental rights, of course, being the First Amendment rights, the right to protest, the right to speak freely. Look, the right to protest and speak freely is a messy business. We should not expect that people that are protesting and speaking up are going to do so in necessarily dignified function. This was never the intention of our founding forefathers, and frankly, dignity and dignified function when you're in protest, those things are oftentimes inconsistent. So our founding forefathers recognized this, and we all need to recognize that in this condition of protest, things are going to necessarily get out of control, and that must be allowed to happen because that's an important bleeder valve that blows off some of this pressure that's building up all across this country. And I think we would be wise to consider that as the Republican National Convention comes here to Tampa. The attempts that are being made to squelch out protest and to shut them down and to cram them into little areas and to try and shut people up are going to be counterproductive. There's going to be blowback. And so what is the appropriate response to that? Well, the appropriate response is to wide open the protest. There should be permits for 24-hour protests on the streets during the entire time that the convention is here. There need to be wide open spaces. There need to be opportunities all through the convention long for people to come out and express themselves. Now, obviously, this has to be done in a way that public safety is not endangered, but there are plenty of wide thoroughfares which would permit wide protest and expression of political thought and political dissent in a manner which is not dangerous and which allows people to properly represent their concerns to our government, petition the world to see what's happening here. I think, for instance, of Bayshore. You know, if I were in charge, I would have in the entire Bayshore Boulevard, which is very close to the Republican National Convention, a wide open space. There's hundreds of yards there in width and miles of length, which would permit a wide thoroughfare for anybody that wants to come to protest. Now, we do it with Gasparilla, right? There's a Gasparilla Festival when we have hundreds of thousands of people, drunken revelers, wild and crazy down the streets down Bayshore, and that's just fine. So why can't that same model be adopted for the Republican National Convention and just really let people have at it? I submit to you that if we took that position and that tack, we would have far less problems than what we see now, which is the over-militarization of law enforcement, 15,000 law enforcement officers coming, tanks and riot gear, and batons. I think that's just fundamentally inconsistent with a free society. But that's a bit of a diversion. The primary issue that I see here in Florida, of course, is this foreclosure battle. And, this is a battle that rages on now. It's been, thick into it since at least 2008. And frankly, I've been at it for many, many years before that. But as we get late into the year 2012, a full 4 years after the crisis really bubbled to the surface, we see that we are losing many important battles as the appellate courts continue to crush the rights of citizens, as the appellate courts continue to interpret laws and rules in ways which are favorable to the corporations, the banks, and the institutions. And this is a terribly disturbing phenomenon because, more and more normal, everyday American citizens are watching what's happening in our court systems, and they're understanding that the courts are no longer standing up for individual liberties. They're no longer standing up for the rights of the common man, the voters, the individual people. And in the face of widespread, rampant, systemic fraud that has been perpetrated on our court system, rather than our court system pushing back against this, our court system is largely affirming the fraud that exists. And so we have these very disturbing appellate decisions which come out recognizing that fraud has been perpetrated on the court system, and yet affirming the conduct by allowing the banks to just walk away. We moonwalk away from the fraud. And of course, the most clear and poignant example of that is the Pino versus Bank of New York case that was recently in the Florida Supreme Court. Now, I really encourage everyone to Google the term Pino versus Bank of New York in the Florida Supreme Court arguments. Those oral arguments are archived and they're out there live. And I want you to pay particular attention to the communication by these Supreme Court justices and the queries and inquisition that was given of the homeowner's attorney that were there. One of the things that I found most disturbing about it was questions and comments about, was this homeowner getting a free house? And the homeowner that was living there free wasn't paying. And the reason why that's so disturbing is those issues were not even before the Supreme Court. It's important to understand that the issue that was presented by the 4th District Court of Appeals, and therefore the only issue that was before the Supreme Court, was what is a court to do when presented with blatant fraud? And the specific quote was, it appears that many foreclosure cases are tainted by fraudulent documents or improper documents or questionable documents. That was the question that was before the Supreme Court, not anything to do with the borrower. And so when we watch the Florida Supreme Court take that disturbing diversion into an area of factual inquiry, which frankly might have been relevant at the trial court, but missed the mark because it didn't address the fundamental issue of what is a court system to do to punish and to check the improper conduct of an institution or a bank. And look, let's keep in mind, when a Supreme Court is considering a case like this and they're looking at making precedent, we're not talking just about a bank or institution. So what we should be focused on is not just the fraud that the banks are creating in our court system. And let's be very specific about what the fraud is. Forgery, creating fraudulent documents, signing signatures by people that are not the alleged signatory, and otherwise just fabricating documents in order to prosecute a case. But let's keep in mind something. This is not just particular to foreclosures. This affects all of civil litigation. And so were I standing in front of the Supreme Court and questions came about foreclosure cases, I would have made it clear that the precedent they're establishing here applies against all civil litigation cases. And so if our Florida Supreme Court continues to affirm these appellate decisions which affirm fraud, forgery, and fabrication, then it sets a dangerous, terrifyingly dangerous precedent which will make its way into all other areas of law. And so, while right now we have become accustomed to widespread fraud, forgery, fabrication, lies, and manipulations in the foreclosure context, we should absolutely expect to see the very same conditions begin to exist in all other areas of litigation in our courtroom. So if we're allowing fraud and forgeries to exist in foreclosure courtroom, why don't we then just use these same opinions which support fraud and forgery as rationale for fraud and forgery in the context of other cases? So what might we find? Well, in the criminal context, we would find that affidavits of probable cause will be forged, robo-signed, and fraudulently produced by law enforcement officers in order to gain entry into people's houses. We would use fraudulent birth certificates and fraudulent affidavits and fraudulent documents in custody and child support cases and adoption cases. We should permit then fraudulent affidavits and fraudulent documents to be used in probate cases, so that when you die, if you have executed a will properly, specifically, by adopting the very same rationale that we're allowing in the foreclosure context, we would allow litigants and officers of court to produce fraudulent, fabricated, and forged documents to support arrest warrants and prosecutions in criminal cases. We would allow litigants in family law cases to produce fabricated, forged, and fraudulent documents in family law cases in order to steal away children from their families and to affect their custody cases. We would allow forged, fabricated, and flawed documents to allow children to be stolen and adopted by other families in other contexts. In the estate context, we right now require original wills to be submitted in court as part of a probate case. But if we adopt the very same rationale that exists in foreclosure courtroom in probate cases, we would permit beneficiaries under wills or people challenging wills to use fabricated, forged, robo-signed wills, submit them to probate court, and allow estates of decedents to be transferred to other people, all the while knowing that that will is fabricated and forged. And that's precisely what we see in foreclosure court. And so it is not at all a stretch to say that if we continue to allow this to occur in foreclosure courtroom, we will allow this to occur in the rest of our court system. And so you see where we're heading, and that is an absolute degradation of our entire society. Our court system is the very last protection we have against this outright tyranny, which is existing all across this country. Our court system is not standing up and being tough enough, nearly tough enough, to protect us against what's happening out there. Now, certainly it's a big problem that in the state of Florida, our court system is funded by less than 1% of the entire state budget. That allows much of this tyranny and violence to continue to occur because our legislative branch knows that judges are not funded properly. Our executive branch knows they can get away with whatever machinations and schemes they care to. And frankly, our judges and their staff are just demoralized and beaten down because they don't have the resources they need to protect us. And that is a fault of all of us, especially the attorneys, but every citizen needs to understand that we cannot have a safe country to live in, a democracy where our rights are respected anymore, as long as our court system has become so degraded and desecrated. And so there must be a recognition across this country, and specifically in the state of Florida, that we as citizens, and particularly we as attorneys, need to be standing up and defending and protecting a court system. And look, I recognize that's a difficult message to make right now, especially when so many of us in the space of foreclosure defense are under attack by the very court system that we should be supporting, that in fact we must be supporting. But frankly, in spite of that, we must do so. So we must go into battle knowing full well that we are facing straight into the guns. And we as attorneys, the consumer fighters on the front lines, know that in fact we are running straight into the gunfire, that the cannons of a very unfair, inequitable, and frankly punitive justice system are pointed squarely at our foreheads. And we need to understand that we are going to take those shots. We'll lose many of our soldiers along the way, and in fact we have soldiers and attorneys who have felt themselves under persecution from our court system, and that's just an unfortunate byproduct of the perilous circumstances that we're in. So there's no question but that foreclosures will continue in this state. We've seen dramatic increases in new foreclosure filings. And the fact that there are so many homes out there which are vacant and abandoned should provoke a greater consideration on the part of our court system and, frankly, our judges to say, why must we continue to generate new foreclosures and to throw more people out into the street when already in our communities we have thousands and in some cases tens of thousands of homes that are already vacant? Why do we need to send another homeowner, another American, another member of our community out into the street as long as the banks and institutions are sitting on these tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of homes? It's just absolutely mind-numbing madness. And so we all, as activists and individuals and attorneys, need to be working, obviously in courtrooms, on our technical skills and presenting cases on a fundamentally appropriate legal and technical basis. But the larger picture is indeed the larger movement, and that is making sure our community and everybody that we interact with understand the dramatic societal consequences of where we are heading in this nation because of this lawlessness that we experience every day in foreclosure. Our fight is not just to protect those clients that we serve and those people that we represent in communities in foreclosure and to protect them from the tyranny of the banks. The larger fight and movement is to communicate to the larger community the fact that this foreclosure tyranny that we see, this breaking down the doors of people's property, is merely the first step in a far more dangerous desecration of this country, where basic rights will continue to be destroyed and where the fundamental protections that we expect out of our court system no longer exist. So that's the larger message. The larger point is to continue to communicate the larger point that hopefully people will get it. We can stand up in a much more creative and substantive way and frankly productive way to support and defend communities.